March 13th, 2013. White smoke rises from a copper chimney above the Sistine Chapel. Inside, 115 cardinals have just elected a new pope. But Jorge Mario Bergoglio sits frozen in his chair, staring at the floor. The other cardinals are already applauding, preparing to congratulate him, and he cannot move. He will later describe this moment as a kind of terror, the weight of what he has just inherited pressing down on him like a physical force. Because Jorge Bergoglio has not simply been elected to lead a church, he has become the absolute monarch of the smallest country on earth, a nation of 121 acres surrounded entirely by Rome, a government that controls its own bank, prints its own currency, issues its own passports, and operates one of the most sophisticated intelligence networks in the world. He has inherited 2,000 years of secrets. Somewhere beneath his feet, in vaults that extend hundreds of feet underground, sit 53 miles of shelving containing documents that most humans will never see. Letters from Michelangelo, the proceedings of Galileo's trial, communications between popes and kings that could rewrite the history books, files on every bishop, every priest, every scandal the church has ever buried. 2 floors above him, in the Apostolic Palace, sit the private apartments where he will sleep for the rest of his life. Rooms decorated with Renaissance frescoes that tourists will never photograph. Hidden passages connecting his bedroom to escape routes built during medieval sieges. A private chapel where he will pray alone each morning before dawn. And in the Basilica next door, directly beneath the main altar, lies the tomb of St. Peter himself, the fisherman who knew Jesus, the rock upon which, according to Catholic doctrine, the entire church was built. Every pope since the 4th century has been buried near this spot. Bergoglio will join them eventually. For now, he must stand up. Walk to the balcony, face the crowd in St. Peter's Square. Step. First Latin American Pope, the first Jesuit, the first to take the name Francis. But as he rises, as the cardinals embrace him, as the master of ceremonies asks if he accepts his election, Jorge Bergoglio already understands something that few people outside these walls ever grasp. The Vatican is not merely a church. It is not merely a country. It is the most powerful institution humanity has ever created, an empire that has outlasted the Romans, the Byzantines, the Habsburgs, and the British, a government that controls 1.3 billion followers across every continent, a treasury of art and architecture and gold that no nation on earth can match. And now, at age 76, this Argentine priest is its king. How did 121 acres become more powerful than nations 1,000 times its size? How does a place smaller than most golf courses command the loyalty of 1/6 of humanity? And what exactly happens behind those walls that the rest of us are never supposed to see? To understand, we need to go back nearly 2,000 years, to a time before the Vatican was sacred, before it was a church, before it was anything at all except a marshy hill where Roman emperors liked to watch people die. The land that would become Vatican City was, for most of ancient history, a place Romans avoided. The right bank of the Tiber River was swampy and prone to malaria. The soil was poor for farming. The hills were too modest for prestigious estates. Wealthy Romans built their villas on the opposite shore, where the 7 hills of Rome offered better views and healthier air. But in the 1st century AD, Emperor Caligula found a use for this neglected territory. He built a private racetrack, a circus, the Romans called it, an oval track for chariot racing, lined with imported sand, surrounded by wooden bleachers. At its center stood an Egyptian obelisk that Caligula had shipped across the Mediterranean. The obelisk still stands today, though in a different location. We'll get to that. Caligula's circus sat at the base of Vatican Hill. The name came from the Etruscan word vaticinium, meaning prophecy. The Etruscans had once used this hill for divination rituals. The Romans considered the place vaguely ominous. Even the name carried echoes of old magic. When Caligula was assassinated in 41 AD, his nephew Nero expanded the circus. More seating, a longer track, better facilities for the spectacles Nero loved. And Nero loved spectacles of a particular kind. On July 18th, 64 AD, fire consumed much of Rome. The blaze burned for 6 days. 10 of the city's 14 districts suffered damage. Nero's political enemies accused him of starting the fire deliberately. He needed someone else to blame. He chose the Christians. This new Jewish sect had been growing in Rome for 3 decades. Their beliefs confused Romans. They refused to worship the emperor. They met in secret. They spoke of a kingdom that wasn't Rome's. And now, according to Nero, they had burned the city. The persecutions began immediately. Tacitus, writing a generation later, described what happened in Nero's circus on Vatican Hill. Christians were wrapped in animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Others were crucified. Some were covered in pitch and set ablaze to illuminate the night races. Nero reportedly rode his chariot among the human torches, enjoying the light they provided. Among those executed, according to Christian tradition, was a man named Simon Peter. Peter had been one of Jesus' 12 apostles. The Gospels portray him as impulsive, loyal, often confused. He denied knowing Jesus 3 times on the night of the crucifixion. But after the resurrection, according to Christian accounts, Jesus restored him. "Feed my sheep," Jesus said. Peter became the leader of the early church. Tradition holds that Peter arrived in Rome sometime in the 40s AD. He led the Christian community there for perhaps 2 decades. When Nero's persecution began, Peter could have fled. Instead, he stayed. He was arrested, sentenced to death, and crucified in Nero's circus, probably in 64 or 65 AD. Peter reportedly asked to be crucified upside down. He did not deserve, he said, to die in the same position as his Lord. After his death, his followers buried him in a cemetery just north of the circus, along the Via Cornelia. The spot was humble, a simple grave among other graves. But his followers remembered where they had laid him. They kept coming back, generation after generation, even during later persecutions, even when discovery meant death. They visited Peter's grave and prayed. By the 2nd century, a small shrine stood over the burial site. The Romans called it a trophy, a marker of victory. Pilgrims traveled from across the Mediterranean to pray there. The grave of the first pope had become sacred ground. For 2.5 centuries, Christianity remained illegal in Rome. Emperors periodically launched persecutions. Christians met in private homes and underground catacombs. Their numbers grew anyway. By 300 AD, perhaps 10% of the empire's population followed the new faith. Then, everything changed. In 312 AD, Constantine defeated his rival Maxentius at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Legend says that before the battle, Constantine saw a vision in the sky, a cross of light with the words, "In this sign, conquer." He ordered his soldiers to paint Christian symbols on their shields. They won. Constantine became the first Christian emperor. Whether his conversion was sincere or political remains debated. What matters is what he did next. In 313 AD, the Edict of Milan legalized Christianity throughout the empire. Churches could own property. Christians could worship openly. The persecuted sect suddenly had an emperor's protection. Constantine wanted to build great churches across the empire to cement his legacy and honor his new god. And in Rome, he decided to build the largest church the world had ever seen. He chose Vatican Hill. This was an unusual decision. The hill was outside the city walls. The ground was unstable. The slope was steep. A large pagan cemetery occupied much of the site. Roman law protected cemeteries. Disturbing graves was sacrilege. Constantine didn't care. He had a specific location in mind. The church had to be built directly over Peter's grave. The construction project was massive. Workers demolished part of the cemetery, carefully preserving certain tombs while destroying others. They leveled portions of the hill, cutting away huge quantities of earth. They filled in low areas with rubble. They created a flat platform where none had existed. Then they built. Old St. Peter's Basilica rose over Peter's grave between roughly 326 and 360 AD. It was 350 feet long, with 5 aisles separated by marble columns taken from pagan temples. The altar stood directly above Peter's tomb. Constantine himself placed a golden cross at the spot, weighing 150 pounds, inscribed with his name and his mother's. The emperor never saw the finished church. He died in 337 AD, but his vision endured. For the next 1,200 years, Old St. Peter's would stand as the spiritual center of Western Christianity. Popes were crowned there. Kings knelt before its altar. Pilgrims walked hundreds of miles to pray at Peter's tomb. The church accumulated treasures, relics, paintings, gold, silver. It became the richest single building in Christendom. But the story beneath the altar was not finished. For centuries, Christians believed Peter was buried under Old St. Peter's. They had no proof. The grave had been built over and enclosed. No one had seen the actual remains since Constantine's time. The location was sacred precisely because of faith, not evidence. In 1939, workers digging a grave for Pope Pius XI in the Basilica's crypt made an unexpected discovery. A gap behind a wall led to an ancient chamber. The chamber led to another, and another. They had found the Roman cemetery that Constantine had buried. Pope Pius XIII authorized a secret excavation. For 10 years, archaeologists worked beneath St. Peter's Basilica, carefully uncovering the necropolis that had been hidden for Wessian 600 years. They found elaborate tombs painted with frescoes, sarcophagi bearing the names of Roman families, mosaics depicting pagan gods alongside early Christian symbols. And at the center of the cemetery, directly beneath the papal altar, they found a small shrine. The trophy mentioned by ancient writers, a memorial built over a grave. The grave itself had been disturbed in antiquity. Most of the bones were missing. Constantine's workers, or perhaps earlier Christians, had removed them at some point. But scratched into a nearby wall, archaeologists found graffiti in Greek. Peter is within. The bones were eventually located in a marble-lined repository nearby. Studies indicated they belonged to a robust man in his 60s or 70s who had lived in the 1st century AD. Fabric still clung to some of them. They had been wrapped in expensive cloth at some point. In 1968, Pope Paul VI announced that the relics of St. Peter had been identified. They remain today in a niche beside the trophy, beneath the altar, beneath the dome that Michelangelo designed. Every Mass celebrated at that altar takes place directly above them. The Vatican exists because of those bones. Constantine built his church there for one reason: to honor the place where Peter died and was buried. Everything that followed, the papal palace, the museums, the archives, the nation itself, grew around that single grave. A fisherman from Galilee who probably never imagined his death would matter to anyone. His bones, real or believed to be real, made Vatican Hill the most sacred ground in Western Christianity. And on that foundation, an empire would rise. For centuries after Constantine, the Vatican was not where popes lived. The Lateran Palace, across Rome near the city, walls, served as the papal residence. Constantine had given the building to the Bishop of Rome shortly after his conversion. It sat on grander grounds, in a more prestigious neighborhood. The Pope ruled the church from the Lateran and visited St. Peter's Basilica for important ceremonies. The Vatican remained a pilgrimage site, impressive but peripheral. Popes maintained a modest residence near the Basilica for occasions when they needed to stay overnight. But the real power sat miles away. Meanwhile, Rome itself was collapsing. The Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD. Germanic tribes sacked the city repeatedly. The population crashed from over 1 million at its peak to perhaps 30,000 by the 6th century. Aqueducts broke. Buildings crumbled. The forums that had anchored Roman civilization became pastures for sheep. The church survived. In many ways, it was the only institution that did. When civil government vanished, people turned to their bishops. The Bishop of Rome, increasingly called Papa, Father, eventually Pope, became the most important figure in the city. He negotiated with invaders. He organized food distribution during famines. He maintained what little infrastructure remained. Pope Gregory XIII, who reigned from 590 to 604 AD, essentially governed Rome. He repaired aqueducts, fed the poor, defended the city against the Lombards, and sent missionaries across Europe. The Pope was no longer merely a spiritual leader. He was becoming a political power. This transition accelerated over the following centuries. The popes needed territory to fund their operations and protect their independence. Between the 8th and 11th centuries, they assembled the Papal States, a swath of central Italy stretching from Rome to the Adriatic Sea. The Pope became both a religious leader and a secular monarch. The Vatican's importance grew with papal power. Old St. Peter's remained the site of coronations and major ceremonies. The papal residence near the Basilica expanded. When popes needed to escape summer heat or political turmoil, they retreated to Vatican Hill. But the complex remained modest compared to what would come. In 846 AD, Saracen raiders sailed up the Tiber and attacked Rome. They couldn't breach the city walls, but Old St. Peter's stood outside those walls. The Basilica was looted. Treasures accumulated over 5 centuries disappeared in a single day. Pope Leo IV responded by building walls. The Leonine Wall enclosed the Vatican Hill for the first time, creating a fortified papal enclave. The Basilica and its surrounding buildings were now protected, separate from Rome proper. This defensive perimeter would eventually define the borders of Vatican City itself. By the late Middle Ages, Vatican Hill had transformed. The Basilica remained the spiritual center, but around it had grown a small city, palaces for cardinals, housing for the papal court, administrative buildings, gardens. The papal residence itself sprawled across multiple connected structures, a hodgepodge of construction from different centuries. The Sistine Chapel rose in this period. Pope Sixtus IV built it between 1473 and 1481 as the official chapel of the papal court. Proportioned to match the Temple of Solomon as described in the Bible, the chapel served practical functions: masses, papal elections, important ceremonies. Its fame would come later, when a temperamental genius covered its ceiling with paint. But the true transformation of the Vatican began with a pope who wanted to tear everything down. Pope Nicholas V, who reigned from 1447 to 1455, looked at Old St. Peter's Basilica and saw decay. The building was over 1,000 years old. Walls were cracking, columns were tilting. The structure that Constantine had built was literally falling apart. Nicholas conceived a radical solution: demolish the old basilica and build something new, something vast, something that would surpass every church ever constructed. He died before work could begin, but his vision planted a seed. In 1503, Pope Julius II, the warrior pope, famous for leading armies into battle personally, decided to make Nicholas's dream reality. He commissioned Donato Bramante to design a new St. Peter's Basilica. Bramante proposed a church in the shape of a Greek cross, centered under an enormous dome. The scale was unprecedented. Julius laid the foundation stone on April 18, 1506. Workers began demolishing old St. Peter's. Columns that had stood for 1,700 years came crashing down. Tombs were relocated. Mosaics were destroyed. Memories of Constantine's church vanished one piece at a time. The destruction horrified many. Erasmus complained that Julius had demolished a church beloved for centuries. But Julius had no patience for sentiment. He wanted glory. He wanted his name attached to the greatest building in Christendom. He died in 1513 with the project barely begun. What followed was 120 years of construction, controversy, and genius. Bramante died in 1514. Raphael took over briefly before dying in 1520. A series of architects proposed competing visions. The church changed shapes multiple times. Work stopped and started as popes came and went. Then, in 1546, Pope Paul III convinced a reluctant Michelangelo to take charge. Michelangelo was 71 years old. He had spent 4 years painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling 3 decades earlier. He had sculpted the Pietà that still stands in St. Peter's. He had no desire to become an architect. He took the commission as a service to God, refusing any salary. He designed the dome. The ribbed dome of St. Peter's Basilica, rising 448 feet from the ground to the top of the cross, remains the tallest dome in the world. Michelangelo based it on Brunelleschi's dome in Florence, but made it larger, higher, more dramatic. He would not live to see it completed. He died in 1564. The dome was finished in 1590. The basilica itself was completed in 1626, exactly 120 years after Julius laid the first stone. Pope Urban VIII consecrated the building on November 18th of that year, the 1200th anniversary of the original consecration by Constantine. But building the new St. Peter's had cost something beyond money. To fund construction, popes had authorized the sale of indulgences, payments that supposedly reduced time in purgatory for the buyer or their deceased relatives. Dominican friar Johann Tetzel traveled through Germany selling these indulgences with the slogan, "As soon as a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs." A German monk named Martin Luther found this practice appalling. In 1517, he posted 95 theses challenging indulgences and other church practices. His protest ignited the Protestant Reformation. Within decades, half of Europe had rejected papal authority. The greatest church in Christendom was built, in part, with money that tore Christianity apart. The dome that dominates Rome's skyline stands as both a triumph of architecture and a monument to the crisis that reshaped the church forever. By the time St. Peter's was finished, the Vatican complex had grown to match it. The Apostolic Palace, the main papal residence, had expanded through centuries of additions into a maze of over 1,000 rooms. The Sistine Chapel now held Michelangelo's ceiling. Gardens covered the northern slopes. Museums housed growing collections of art and antiquities. Vatican Hill was no longer a swampy refuge outside Rome's walls. It was the center of an empire. The Apostolic Palace is not one building. It is many buildings fused together over 500 years, connected by corridors that twist through different centuries of construction. Walking through it means passing from medieval chambers into Renaissance galleries into Baroque apartments without warning. This matters because architecture shapes power. Who can reach the Pope? How quickly? Through what spaces? These details determine how the Vatican actually functions. The building is designed to control access as much as to provide shelter. The public never sees most of it. Tourists enter through the Vatican museums, which occupy the northern portion of the complex. They follow prescribed routes through galleries of classical sculpture, Renaissance paintings, ancient maps. The Sistine Chapel waits at the end, always crowded, voices echoing off Michelangelo's ceiling despite the guards' constant requests for silence. But the museums are just the public face. They were assembled starting in the 16th century when popes began displaying their art collections for visitors. The galleries were designed to impress, and they succeed. But they are separate from the working Vatican, the offices, the residences, the places where decisions are actually made. The heart of papal power is the Apostolic Palace proper. Its official entrance sits in the right-hand colonnade of St. Peter's Square, through the bronze door guarded by Swiss guards in their Renaissance uniforms. Beyond that door lies a different world. The Scala Regia, the royal staircase, rises from the entrance designed by Bernini in the 17th century to create an optical illusion of greater length and height than the space actually contains. Every visitor ascending to meet the Pope walks up these stairs. The architecture is designed to make them feel small. At the top, corridors branch in multiple directions. One path leads to the Sala Regia, the royal hall, where popes once received ambassadors and monarchs. Another leads to the Pauline Chapel, the Pope's private chapel, which holds two late Michelangelo frescoes that few visitors ever see. The Sistine Chapel connects to both, but through doors that remain locked during public visiting hours. During papal elections, the cardinals enter through the royal hall, process through rooms that tourists never access, and seal themselves inside the Sistine Chapel until a new pope emerges. The conclave takes its name from the Latin cum clave, with a key. The cardinals are literally locked in. The doors are sealed. Guards patrol outside. No communication with the exterior is permitted. Food is delivered through specially constructed hatches designed to prevent passing messages. This isolation is not merely symbolic. Multiple papal elections throughout history were corrupted by outside pressure. Secular rulers bribed cardinals. Mobs threatened violence. Cardinals were imprisoned until they voted the right way. The conclave system evolved specifically to prevent such interference. When the cardinals have chosen, ballots are burned in a special stove. The smoke rises through a copper pipe and chimney added to the Sistine Chapel roof specifically for this purpose. Black smoke means no decision. White smoke means a new pope reigns. But the apartments where popes actually live sit above and beyond the Sistine Chapel in the portion of the palace that overlooks St. Peter's Square. Every Sunday at noon, when he is in Rome, the Pope appears at a window on the top floor to lead the Angelus prayer and wave to the crowd below. That window opens from the papal study. The papal apartment occupies the top floor of the Apostolic Palace. It includes a bedroom, a private chapel, a study, a library, several reception rooms, a small kitchen, and accommodations for the household staff who serve the Pope directly. The decoration varies by occupant. Some popes fill the rooms with art. Others prefer simplicity. Pope Francis famously declined to live there. He considered the apartment too grand, too isolated from normal human contact. Instead, he resides in a small suite in the Domus Sanctae Marthae, a guest house built during John Paul II's reign to house cardinals during conclaves. His choice was deliberate, a statement about the kind of pope he intended to be. But whether or not the reigning pope sleeps there, the Apostolic Palace remains, the ceremonial and administrative center of the Vatican. The Secretariat of State operates from offices in the palace. Cardinals and bishops arrive for meetings. Diplomats present credentials. The machinery of a global church grinds through these corridors daily, and the palace contains rooms the public will never see. The Stanza di Raffaello, Raphael's rooms, are partially open to museum visitors. They were Julius II's personal apartments, decorated by Raphael and his workshop in the early 16th century. The frescoes are famous: the School of Athens, the Disputation of the Holy Sacrament, the Liberation of St. Peter. But the adjoining rooms remain private. They include the Pope's audience chambers, the Sala Clementina, the Sala del Consistoro, the Sala Ducale, where popes receive visitors according to strict protocol. The size of the room, the formality of the setting, the number of people present all communicate subtle messages about the importance of the visitor. Below the main floors lie older sections of the palace, medieval foundations, rooms that predate the Renaissance reconstruction. Some of these spaces have been converted to modern uses. Others remain essentially unchanged for centuries. The palace contains multiple private chapels beyond the Sistine. The Pauline Chapel, mentioned earlier, holds Michelangelo's last paintings, the Crucifixion of St. Peter and the Conversion of St. Paul, completed when the artist was in his 70s. The Cappella Nicolina features frescoes by Fra Angelico depicting the lives of Saints Stephen and Lawrence. The Matilde Chapel serves as a more intimate space for papal masses. Most significant is the Redemptoris Mater Chapel, completely renovated in 1999 with modern mosaics in Byzantine style commissioned by John Paul II. The glittering golden-colored glass represents the most significant artistic addition to the palace in centuries. Few outsiders have ever seen it. The palace also contains passages designed for escape. The Passetto di Borgo is an elevated corridor running from the Vatican Palace to the Castel Sant'Angelo, a fortress half a mile away. The Passetto was built in 1277, strengthened in the 15th century, and has saved popes' lives on multiple occasions. In 1494, when French King Charles VIII invaded Italy, Pope Alexander VI fled through the Passetto as enemy troops approached. In 1527, during the catastrophic sack of Rome by Holy Roman Emperor Charles V's troops, Pope Clement VII ran through the Passetto, while Swiss guards died defending his retreat. The guards' sacrifice on May 6, 1527, when 147 of them were killed, is still commemorated every year in their swearing-in ceremony. The Passetto remains intact. It is occasionally opened for special tours, but is otherwise closed to the public. Its purpose as an escape route has been supplemented by modern additions. The Vatican reportedly maintains multiple secure evacuation plans involving underground routes, helicopter extraction, and prearranged safe locations throughout Italy. Beyond the palace, the Vatican contains spaces that even most residents rarely enter. The necropolis beneath St. Peter's, the excavated Roman cemetery, is accessible only through special arrangement. Tours are limited to small groups and must be booked months in advance. The atmosphere is intimate, even claustrophobic. You walk among tombs that have not seen daylight in 16 centuries. The Vatican grottos, a level above the necropolis but still below the Basilica floor, hold the tombs of popes. Most pontiffs from the 20th century lie here, along with earlier popes whose remains were relocated during various constructions. John Paul II was interred here before being moved to a more prominent location after his beatification. And then there is the secret archive. The name conjures images of hidden vaults and forbidden knowledge. The reality is both more mundane and more remarkable than conspiracy theories suggest. The Archivum Secretum Vaticanum, the Vatican Secret Archive, recently renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archive, contains documents accumulated by the papacy over more than 12 centuries. The name secret comes from the Latin secretum, meaning private or personal. It refers to the Pope's private archive, as opposed to public records. The archive occupies multiple buildings within the Vatican complex. The original repository sits beneath the Cortile del Belvedere. Modern climate-controlled facilities have been added. In total, the archive contains 53 miles of shelving, holding documents from the 8th century to the present. What's in there? Letters between popes and emperors, diplomatic correspondence spanning 1,000 years, the proceedings of church councils, financial records of papal administration, the trial records of the Inquisition, the petition from English nobles asking Pope Clement VII to annul Henry VIII's marriage, The archive opened to qualified researchers in 1881. Today, about 1,500 scholars access it annually, but access remains restricted. You must prove academic credentials. You can request specific documents but cannot browse freely. The finding aids are incomplete. Many holdings have never been cataloged, and certain sections remain closed entirely. Documents from the pontificate of Pius X, who was pope during World War II, remained sealed until 2020. The debate over Pius's response to the Holocaust made this closure controversial for decades. Researchers can now examine those files, though fully processing millions of pages will take years. Newer documents remain restricted under what the Vatican calls the pontifical secret. Material from the past 75 years is generally unavailable. This means files from papacies, including John Paul II's, remain closed, despite the massive global interest in his lengthy reign. The archive also contains what it calls permanent secrets, documents deemed too sensitive ever to release. The exact nature of these holdings is unknown. Speculation ranges from suppressed gospels to evidence of church scandals to diplomatic secrets that could still cause international incidents. The Vatican neither confirms nor denies. Conspiracy theories thrive on such secrecy. The archive has been accused of hiding everything from the true identity of Jesus to proof of extraterrestrial contact to the collected prophecies of every pope. The mundane reality that most holdings are bureaucratic records comprehensible mainly to specialized historians does little to diminish the mythology. The Vatican's physical structure reinforces its mystique. Walls within walls, rooms within rooms, corridors that lead nowhere, passages whose purposes have been forgotten. The entire complex was built incrementally by dozens of different builders over many centuries without any master plan. The result is a labyrinth that even long-time residents find confusing, and that confusion, whether intentional or accidental, serves the Vatican's purposes perfectly. An institution built on mystery profits from architecture that preserves mystery. The secrets may be mundane. The locked doors may hide nothing but dusty filing cabinets, but the possibility of hidden knowledge, the sense that somewhere, behind some door, answers await, keeps the world fascinated with 121 acres of medieval construction. The palace is a stage. The Vatican learned centuries ago that power depends partly on performance. The rooms, the rituals, the glimpses of hidden spaces, all of it maintains the sense that this small hill contains something the rest of the world can never fully possess. Pope Julius II was not a patient man. In 1508, he summoned Michelangelo to Rome with an offer the sculptor couldn't refuse: paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo protested. He was a sculptor, not a painter. The ceiling was an impossible commission, 12,000 square feet of curved surface, 68 feet above the floor. He suspected his rivals had suggested the project specifically to humiliate him. Julius didn't care. He wanted the greatest artist of the age working in his chapel. If Michelangelo failed, Julius would find someone else. If he succeeded, Julius would claim credit for the vision. Michelangelo spent 4 years on the scaffolding. He painted standing up, head tilted back, paint dripping into his eyes. He wrote poetry complaining about the physical toll. My beard toward heaven, I feel the back of my brain upon my neck. My brush above my face continually makes it a splendid floor by dripping down. He fired his assistants early in the project, dissatisfied with their work. He completed the vast majority of the ceiling alone, working from pre-dawn until darkness made painting impossible. He became so focused that he sometimes forgot to eat. His health deteriorated. His eyesight suffered damage that would never fully heal. What emerged was the greatest single artwork of the Renaissance. The ceiling tells the story of creation and humanity's fall. In the center, 9 panels depict scenes from Genesis, God separating light from darkness, creating the sun and moon, creating Adam, expelling Adam and Eve from Eden. Around these central images sit prophets and sibyls, the figures from Jewish and pagan tradition who supposedly foretold Christ's coming. In the corners, dramatic scenes show God's salvation of the Jewish people, the creation of Adam, God's finger extending toward Adam's, almost but not quite touching, has become one of the most reproduced images in history. Art historians have analyzed every detail. The shape of the cloak around God, said to resemble the human brain, the position of the figures. Adam is passive, waiting. God is dynamic, reaching. The empty space between the fingers, humanity forever straining toward the divine. Michelangelo finished in October 1512. Julius reportedly couldn't wait for the scaffolding to come down. He rushed into the chapel to see the completed work, fell to his knees, and wept. The Pope was dead within 4 months, but the ceiling has survived 5 centuries. Nearly 6 million visitors enter the Sistine Chapel each year, roughly 25,000 per day during peak season. They stream through the Vatican museums, following arrows painted on the floor until they reach the chapel's worn wooden doors. Inside, guards repeat the same phrases in multiple languages. Silence, please, no photographs. Visitors ignore both requests. Cameras flash despite the prohibition. The noise level rarely drops below a loud murmur. People lie on the floor to get better views of the ceiling. Others push toward the altar to see Michelangelo's other masterpiece in the room. The Last Judgment covers the entire altar wall. Michelangelo painted it between 1536 and 1541, more than 2 decades after completing the ceiling. He was 66 years old when he finished. The work depicts Christ's return and the separation of the saved from the damned. Heaven rises on the left, hell sinks on the right. Christ stands at the center, muscular and stern, his raised arm passing judgment on all humanity. The fresco caused immediate controversy. Michelangelo painted his figures nude. Critics found this inappropriate for a chapel where popes celebrated Mass. One papal master of ceremonies, Biagio da Cesena, complained that the painting belonged in a tavern, not a church. Michelangelo responded by painting Cesena's face onto Minos, the judge of hell, complete with donkey ears and a serpent coiled around his body. After Michelangelo's death, Pope Pius IV ordered another artist to paint loincloths over the most prominent genitals. Daniele da Volterra earned the nickname Il Braghettone, the breeches maker, for this work. Subsequent restorations have debated whether to remove these additions. The loincloths remain. But the Sistine Chapel is only the beginning of the Vatican's art collection. The Vatican museums contain over 70,000 works, of which about 20,000 are on display at any given time. The collection spans human history from ancient Egyptian artifacts to contemporary pieces commissioned by recent popes. Walking through the galleries is walking through 5,000 years of artistic achievement. The Pio Clementino Museum holds one of the world's greatest collections of classical sculpture. The Laocoon and his sons, depicting the Trojan priest being strangled by serpents, was excavated in Rome in 1506 and immediately acquired by Julius II. The Apollo Belvedere, considered for centuries the perfect representation of masculine beauty, has stood in the same niche since the early 1500s. The Raphael rooms contain the artist's greatest frescoes. The School of Athens depicts philosophers from across antiquity gathered in an imagined classical building. Plato and Aristotle stand at the center, surrounded by figures representing mathematics, astronomy, music, and rhetoric. Raphael painted himself into the scene, looking out at the viewer from the lower right corner. The Pinacoteca holds painting from the Byzantine era through the 19th century. Raphael's Transfiguration hangs here. his last work, unfinished at his death, completed by his students. Caravaggio's Entombment of Christ demonstrates the dramatic lighting that revolutionized painting. Leonardo da Vinci's St. Jerome shows the master's obsessive attention to anatomical detail. The Gallery of Maps stretches for 120 meters along the western side of the Belvedere courtyard. Painted between 1580 and 1583, the 40 topographical maps depict Italian regions as they appeared in the late 16th century. The detail is remarkable. You can trace individual streets in cities that have since changed entirely. The Ethnological Museum contains artifacts from cultures around the world, assembled largely through missionary activity. Some of these holdings have become controversial as debates over cultural repatriation have intensified. The Vatican has returned some objects to their countries of origin, but retains enormous collections from Africa, Asia, and the Americas. And then there is the collection of modern religious art housed in the Borgia Apartments. Pope Paul VI opened this gallery in 1973, displaying works by artists including Matisse, Dalí, Chagall, and Bacon. The juxtaposition of contemporary art with Renaissance frescoes makes for jarring transitions. A Francis Bacon Pope screaming behind glass sits not far from where the historical Borgia Pope once slept. The Vatican uses its art strategically. Masterpieces go on tour, drawing crowds and generating goodwill in cities around the world. Loans are diplomatic tools. Offering a Raphael to a national museum can smooth relationships with governments. The museums themselves generate substantial revenue, with ticket prices currently around 17 euros per person and special tours costing significantly more. But the art also serves the Vatican's deeper purpose, projecting the Church's historical importance and cultural authority. Every tourist who gazes at Michelangelo's ceiling absorbs the message that this institution has shaped civilization. The art argues for the Church's relevance without needing to speak a word. The collections also raise difficult questions. Much of what the Vatican owns was acquired through conquest, colonization, or the exercise of papal power that no longer exists. Egyptian obelisks were shipped to Rome by emperors who plundered the Nile Valley. Sculptures were taken from Greece when Roman generals treated defeated nations as shopping opportunities. Medieval popes accepted gifts that were essentially bribes from rulers seeking papal favor. The Vatican's response to repatriation requests has been mixed. In 2010, it returned the Obelisk of Axum, a 1,700-year-old Ethiopian monument taken by Mussolini's troops in 1937 to Ethiopia. But it has resisted other claims, arguing that its stewardship preserves objects that might be lost or damaged elsewhere. The debate may intensify as awareness of colonial-era acquisitions grows. The Vatican's position, that it holds these works in trust for all humanity, is increasingly contested by scholars and governments who argue that cultural patrimony belongs with the peoples who created it. For now, the art remains. Millions of visitors each year walk through galleries that represent both human achievement and human acquisition. The Vatican's collection is simultaneously a gift to the world and a reminder of how that gift was assembled. And it continues to grow. Recent popes have commissioned new works for the collection. Contemporary artists have been invited to create pieces for Vatican spaces. The institution that sponsored Michelangelo and Raphael still sees itself as a patron of the arts, though operating on a smaller scale than Renaissance ambitions allowed. The art tells a story the Vatican wants told, that this place matters, that it has always mattered, that it will continue to matter long after the current controversies fade. The propaganda is embedded in beauty, the message delivered through masterpieces that leave visitors speechless. And every tourist who exits through the gift shop, buying a reproduction of the creations of Adam or a Sistine Chapel coffee mug, carries that message home. Every day at 6:45 in the morning, Swiss guards gather in their barracks for inspection. They check the fit of their armor, they polish their halberds, they ensure their Renaissance-era uniforms, the famous blue, red, and gold stripes, are properly arranged. Then they take their positions at entrances throughout the Vatican, standing motionless for hours while tourists photograph them as if they were statues rather than soldiers. The Swiss Guard is the smallest and oldest standing army in the world. It consists of approximately 135 men, all of whom must be Swiss citizens, Catholic, unmarried, and between 19 and 30 years old. They must have completed Swiss military training. They must stand at least 5 feet 8 inches tall. They commit to a minimum of 2 years of service. Their uniforms attract the most attention. The striped costume, designed, according to legend, by Michelangelo himself, though this is probably false, looks like something from a medieval pageant. Tourists assume the guards are ceremonial decorations, like the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace. This assumption is wrong. The Swiss Guard is a genuine military force. Guards carry halberds for ceremonial purposes, but are also trained in modern weapons, martial arts, and close protection techniques. They maintain firearms in their barracks. During high-security events, you might notice that some guards' positions allow clear sight lines to potential threat vectors. The colorful uniforms disguise a professional protection detail. The guard's history explains its continued existence. Pope Julius II, the same pope who commissioned the Sistine Chapel ceiling, established the Swiss Guard in 1506. He needed reliable soldiers. Italian mercenaries frequently switched sides. Political alliances shifted constantly. But Swiss soldiers had earned a Europe-wide reputation for discipline and loyalty. They fought for whoever paid them and did not abandon their employers. Julius recruited his first contingent from the Swiss cantons. On January 22, 1506, 150 Swiss soldiers marched into Rome and took up positions at the Vatican. They have never left. Their defining moment came on May 6, 1527. Holy Roman Emperor Charles V's troops arrived at Rome seeking unpaid wages. When the city proved unable or unwilling to pay, the soldiers, many of them Lutheran Germans with particular hostility toward the Pope, began looting. The sack of Rome would last months and devastate the city. Pope Clement VII fled through the Passetto di Borgo toward Castel Sant'Angelo. The Swiss Guard covered his retreat. Of the 189 guards stationed at the Vatican that morning, 147 died defending the Basilica steps. Their commander fell with them. A small contingent, about 42 men, fought a rearguard action that allowed Clement to escape. Every May 6th, new recruits swear their oath of service on the anniversary of this sacrifice. They gather in the courtyard of San Damaso, raise 3 fingers to represent the Holy Trinity, and pledge to give their lives, if necessary, to protect the Pope. The ceremony has not changed in centuries. Modern Swiss guards face different threats than their predecessors: terrorist attacks, deranged individuals seeking to harm the Pope, crowds that could crush a public figure through sheer enthusiasm. The guards train constantly for scenarios that might seem unlikely but have historical precedent. In 1981, Mehmet Ali Aka shot Pope John Paul II in St. Peter's Square. The Pope survived, but the attack demonstrated that papal security required modernization. The Swiss Guard subsequently integrated more closely with Vatican gendarmerie, the Vatican's police force, and Italian security services. Intelligence sharing increased. Protocols were updated. The Guard's barracks occupy a building near St. Anne's Gate. Living conditions are modest. Small rooms, shared facilities, strict rules about visitors and overnight guests. Pay is low by Swiss standards. Guards cannot marry during their first years of service, and even afterward must obtain special permission. Why do young Swiss men choose this life? For some, it's religious devotion. the chance to serve the Pope directly. For others, it's family tradition. Many guards come from families that have sent sons to Rome for generations. Some seek adventure, or escape from provincial Swiss life, or simply the distinction of having served in the world's most famous military unit. After completing their service, former guards often find that the experience opens doors. The Swiss Guard's reputation for discretion and reliability makes veterans attractive to security firms, diplomatic services, and corporations seeking protection professionals. The uniform that looks like fancy dress represents serious training and proven discipline. The Guard's ceremonial functions remain important. They stand at attention during papal audiences. They line the route when the Pope enters St. Peter's Basilica. They guard the entrance to the Apostolic Palace. Every formal event involves guards in their distinctive costumes, adding visual continuity to ceremonies that connect the modern church to its Renaissance past. But beneath the pageantry, real security work continues. Guards rotate through different positions during their service. Some postings are public, standing at gates where tourists aim cameras. Others are less visible, monitoring surveillance systems, accompanying the Pope on travels, providing close protection in crowds. The Vatican security apparatus extends well beyond the Swiss Guard. The Gendarmerie Corps handles police functions, traffic control, and criminal investigation within Vatican City. Italian police provide perimeter security outside Vatican territory. Intelligence services from multiple countries share information about potential threats. The Pope travels in an armored vehicle, the Pope-mobile, designed to provide visibility while protecting against attacks. Yet the Swiss Guard remains the public face of Vatican security. Their presence says something specific, that this institution has protected itself with foreign soldiers for over 500 years, that it will continue to do so, that the Pope's safety rests ultimately with men who have sworn to die for him if necessary. In an age of corporate security consultants and surveillance technology, there is something deliberately archaic about maintaining an army in striped uniforms carrying medieval weapons. The Vatican could hire professional bodyguards who would blend into crowds. Instead, it maintains soldiers whose costumes announce their presence. The choice is intentional. The Swiss Guard embodies continuity. When tourists photograph them, they photograph an unbroken line stretching back to 1506. The institution that employs these soldiers has outlasted the Holy Roman Empire, the Napoleonic Wars, 2 world wars, and the rise and fall of countless governments. The Guards are a message. We are still here. We will still be here when everyone who threatens us has been forgotten. Vatican City maintains its own post office, pharmacy, supermarket, gas station, and helipad. It issues license plates, although only a few hundred vehicles are registered. It prints stamps that collectors prize. It operates its own newspaper, the Osservatore Romano, and its own television station, the Vatican Media. Approximately 800 people hold Vatican citizenship. Most are clergy, cardinals, bishops, priests serving in Vatican offices. Others are Swiss guards, diplomats, or lay people whose work requires residence within the walls. Citizenship is not hereditary. When your service ends, so does your status as a Vatican citizen. Perhaps 4,500 people work within Vatican City on any given day, most of them Italian citizens who commute from Rome. They staff the museums, maintain the buildings, tend the gardens, process the paperwork that keeps a global church functioning. They pass through checkpoints each morning and return home each evening to apartments in surrounding neighborhoods. The Vatican operates on its own time, sometimes literally. Until 1967, Vatican City was 1 hour ahead of Rome. Pope Paul VI synchronized with Italy, but the Vatican's unofficial schedule remains distinct. Offices open and close according to rhythms that confuse outsiders. Lunch breaks stretch longer than typical Italian practice. Summer hours reduce operations dramatically. Daily life begins early. The Pope typically rises before 5 a.m. for private prayer and meditation. Mass in his private chapel follows. Breakfast is simple: coffee, perhaps some bread. By the time most of Rome has woken, the Pope has already been working for hours. The papal day unfolds according to a schedule set by the prefecture of the papal household. Morning hours often involve meetings with cardinals or heads of Vatican departments, audiences with visiting dignitaries, bishops reporting on their dioceses, or groups seeking papal blessing fill midday slots. Lunch provides a break. Afternoons bring more meetings, review of documents, and preparation for the following day. Wednesdays, when the Pope is in Rome, feature the general audience. Thousands of pilgrims and tourists gather in St. Peter's Square or in the Paul VI audience hall during bad weather to see the Pope, hear a short teaching, and receive his blessing. These events are free but require tickets distributed through the prefecture. Sundays bring the Angelus. At noon, the Pope appears at the window of his study overlooking St. Peter's Square. He leads a brief prayer, offers reflections on the day's gospel reading, and greets pilgrims in multiple languages. The crowd waves flags from their home countries. The Pope acknowledges different groups. For perhaps 20 minutes, the square becomes a gathering of the global church. Beyond these public moments, the Pope's time belongs to administration. The Vatican bureaucracy, the Roman Curia, operates like a small government. The Secretariat of State handles diplomatic relations with nearly 200 countries. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith monitors theological orthodoxy. The Congregation for Bishops oversees the appointment of bishops worldwide. Other departments manage Catholic education, clergy discipline, Eastern churches, saints' causes, and dozens of other portfolios. Each department generates paperwork that eventually reaches the Pope's desk. Appointments require his approval. Doctrinal statements need his signature. Diplomatic negotiations demand his attention. The volume is staggering. Popes rely on secretaries and advisors to filter information, but the final decisions often rest with one man. John Paul II was famous for working late into the night, personally reviewing documents that previous popes had delegated. Benedict XVI brought a scholarly approach, preferring written reports to verbal briefings. Francis reportedly prefers phone calls, picking up the receiver to speak directly with cardinals, bishops, or even ordinary Catholics who have caught his attention. Beyond the papal schedule, Vatican employees follow their own routines. The museums open at 9 a.m. Cleaning crews have already worked through the night, dusting sculptures and mopping floors that will be scuffed by thousands of feet before day's end. Guards take their positions. Ticket sellers prepare for lines that form before dawn during high season. In the Apostolic Palace, offices open around 8:30 a.m. Bureaucrats process correspondence, prepare reports, and attend meetings. The pace is deliberate. The Vatican measures decisions in years or decades, not news cycles. Urgency is rare. Patience is institutional. The Vatican gardens offer respite. Covering about half of Vatican City's territory, the gardens feature formal Italian landscaping, English lawns, woodland areas, and extensive plantings. Popes have walked these paths for centuries, seeking quiet amid administrative pressures. Staff can obtain permission to stroll during lunch breaks. The gardens contain surprises. A grotto recreates the shrine at Lourdes. A medieval tower serves as a Vatican radio transmission point. A small train station, used only a few times in Vatican history, sits near the western wall. The Pontifical Academy of Sciences meets in a building hidden among the trees. Food service operates from several locations. The employees' cafeteria provides affordable meals for Vatican workers. A separate facility serves Swiss guards. Visiting dignitaries receive catering from different arrangements. The Pope typically eats simple food prepared by his household staff. The Vatican supermarket, accessible only to those with Vatican identification, offers goods at duty-free prices. Romans with Vatican connections sometimes do grocery shopping there, taking advantage of savings on everything from wine to washing machines. The pharmacy operates similarly, providing medications without Italian prescription requirements. The Vatican Bank, officially the Institute for the Works of Religion, or IOR, occupies a medieval tower near the Apostolic Palace. Its clients include Vatican departments, religious orders, clergy, and Vatican employees. The bank has been controversial. We'll discuss its scandals in a later chapter. For employees, it provides basic banking services and the convenience of working on the same campus as their financial institution. At the end of each workday, most employees depart. The Swiss guards at St. Anne's Gate check identifications as people exit. Traffic on Via della Conciliazione, the broad avenue leading to St. Peter's, becomes clogged with departing workers mixing with arriving tourists. By evening, Vatican City grows quiet. The museums close, the Basilica empties, tourists disperse to Roman restaurants. Only residents remain: the clergy, the guards, the small community that actually lives behind the walls. Night brings different rhythms. Guards patrol in shifts. Lights burn in offices where work continues. The Pope retires to his quarters. The Basilica stands dark except for security lighting. And beneath it all, in climate-controlled vaults, in sealed archives, in rooms most people will never see, the accumulated history of 2 millennia waits in silence. Letters from kings, confessions of heretics, financial records tracing centuries of wealth, the secrets that make the Vatican, preserved in darkness until someone with proper authorization retrieves them. The smallest country in the world goes to sleep. In the morning, it will wake and do all of this again, as it has done, with variations, for longer than most nations have existed. The century between 1450 and 1550 transformed the Vatican from a medieval pilgrimage site into the headquarters of a Renaissance empire. It also produced popes who would have embarrassed a Roman emperor. Nicholas V, who reigned from 1447 to 1455, established the template. He believed the church needed splendor to demonstrate its power. He began assembling the library that would become the Vatican Library. He commissioned translations of Greek classics. He planned the reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica. He hired humanist scholars and artists to create a court that could rival any European monarchy. His successors embraced the magnificence while abandoning restraint. Sixtus IV, Pope from 1471 to 1484, built the Sistine Chapel and stocked it with frescoes by Botticelli, Perugino, and other masters. He also practiced nepotism so extensively that his name gave us the English word. He made 6 of his nephews cardinals. He appointed relatives to profitable church positions across Italy. When Florence resisted his territorial ambitions, he blessed an assassination plot against Lorenzo de' Medici. The plot failed. Lorenzo's brother Giuliano died instead. The Borgias came next. Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI in 1492. He had served as vice-chancellor of the church for decades, growing rich from ecclesiastical offices. His election reportedly involved substantial bribes. 4 mule loads of silver allegedly traveled from Borgia's palace to Cardinal Sforza's residence on the night before the vote. Alexander fathered at least 7 children, several while wearing cardinal's robes. He acknowledged them openly and worked to advance their interests. His son, Cesare, became a cardinal at age 18, then abandoned church life to pursue military conquest. His daughter, Lucrezia, was married off 3 times to cement political alliances. The Vatican during Alexander's reign hosted parties that shocked even Renaissance Italy. Contemporary accounts, admittedly from hostile sources, describe orgies in the Apostolic Palace. One event allegedly featured 50 prostitutes crawling on the floor to collect chestnuts while spectators wagered on the activity. Alexander died in 1503, possibly from malaria, possibly from poison intended for someone else. The Borgia's power collapsed almost immediately. Cesare died in battle 4 years later. The family became synonymous with corruption, though historians debate whether they were worse than their contemporaries or simply had better propagandists opposing them. Julius II succeeded after a brief intervening pontificate. The warrior pope combined genuine artistic patronage. Michelangelo, Raphael, Bramante all worked for him, with personal participation in military campaigns. He wore armor, he rode with his troops, he besieged cities. When his army conquered a fortress, Julius personally entered to claim victory. His successors continued the pattern of magnificence financed by problematic means. Leo X, a Medici, allegedly said upon his election, "God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." He spent lavishly on art, music, and hunting. He bankrupted the Vatican treasury within 2 years. His solution, aggressive indulgence selling to fund St. Peter's construction, helped trigger the Protestant Reformation. Clement VII, another Medici, inherited the consequences. The sack of Rome in 1527 devastated the city and trapped Clement in Castel Sant'Angelo for months. His refusal to annul Henry VIII's marriage cost England to the Church. By the time he died in 1534, Protestantism had swept northern Europe. The Council of Trent, which met intermittently from 1545 to 1563, finally addressed the Church's credibility crisis. It reformed education for priests, clarified doctrine, and attempted to eliminate the worst abuses. The Counter-Reformation that followed produced popes who were generally more pious and less scandalous than their Renaissance predecessors. But the Vatican never fully abandoned its taste for political power. Popes remained temporal rulers of the Papal States until 1870. They negotiated with kings, signed treaties, maintained armies, and intervened in European affairs. The institution that claimed to represent Christ on earth behaved like any other Renaissance principality, forming alliances, fighting wars, and pursuing wealth. The art remains. The Sistine Chapel ceiling exists because Julius II wanted glory. St. Peter's Basilica exists because multiple popes emptied treasuries to build it. The Vatican museums hold collections assembled through centuries of papal acquisition, much of it problematic by modern standards. The Renaissance popes understood something about power that their critics often miss. Institutions survive through strength, not humility. The Church needed splendor to compete with kings. It needed armies to protect its territory. It needed wealth to maintain its influence. Whether this approach served Christ's message is a different question. The reformers who split Christianity in the 16th century certainly thought not. But the institution they attacked still exists, headquartered in buildings those Renaissance popes commissioned. The Borgias are a scandal. St. Peter's Basilica is a cathedral. The Vatican kept both. For over 1,000 years, popes ruled central Italy. Then, in a single autumn, they lost everything. The Papal States had evolved since the 8th century into a significant Italian territory. Stretching from Rome across the peninsula to the Adriatic coast, they provided the papacy with revenue, military resources, and political independence. The Pope was not merely a spiritual leader, he was a king. This arrangement survived medieval chaos, Renaissance power politics, and Napoleon's brief conquest. By 1860, the Papal States remained one of the last obstacles to Italian unification. The various kingdoms, duchies, and territories of the peninsula were being absorbed into a new Italian nation-state. The Pope's territory stood in the way. Pope Pius IX, Pio IX, had begun his reign in 1846 as a reformer. He granted a constitution, freed political prisoners, and seemed open to Italian nationalism. But the revolutions of 1848 frightened him. When his prime minister was assassinated and a Roman republic declared, Pius fled to Naples. French troops restored him to power in 1850. He returned as a reactionary. No more constitutions, no more reforms. He would later publish the Syllabus of Errors condemning liberalism, modernism, and the separation of church and state. He convened the First Vatican Council, which proclaimed papal infallibility in matters of faith and morals. He became the most conservative pope in centuries. Meanwhile, Italian nationalism advanced. The Kingdom of Sardinia, under Prime Minister Cavour and King Victor Emmanuel II, annexed territory after territory. Austria was defeated. The Bourbon Kingdom of Naples fell. The smaller duchies were absorbed. By 1860, only Rome and its immediate surroundings remained outside the New Italy, protected solely by French troops Napoleon III had stationed there. When the Franco-Prussian War began in 1870, France recalled its soldiers. The Pope's protection vanished. Victor Emmanuel sent troops toward Rome with orders to take the city. On September 20th, 1870, Italian artillery opened a breach in the Aurelian Wall near the Porta Pia. The papal army, about 15,000 men, many of them foreign volunteers, mounted brief resistance. 49 soldiers died. Pius IX ordered the white flag raised. He would not, he said, have more lives lost for a cause already decided. The Pope retreated behind the Vatican walls. He declared himself a prisoner of the Vatican and refused to set foot in Italian territory. He would not recognize the legitimacy of the Italian state that had stolen his kingdom. Neither would his successors for the next 59 years. The Roman question became a festering diplomatic wound. Catholics worldwide were urged to shun the Italian government. Pilgrims visiting Rome faced the awkward situation of traveling through a country their spiritual leader considered illegitimate to reach a Vatican that had become a besieged enclave. The popes continued to reign from within their shrinking domain. They received ambassadors. They conducted church business. They lived in the Apostolic Palace. But they never crossed the boundary into Rome. When they traveled, they used the Vatican gardens rather than Rome's streets. 3 popes maintained this self-imposed imprisonment. Pius IX died in 1878. Leo XIII, his successor, reigned until 1903. Pius X continued the protest until his death in 1914. Each pope remained within Vatican walls, refusing to acknowledge Italy's existence as a legitimate state. The resolution came from an unlikely source. Benito Mussolini seized power in Italy in 1922. The fascist dictator understood that legitimacy from the Church would strengthen his regime. The Church understood that resolving the Roman question would benefit Catholicism. Negotiations began secretly in 1926. On February 11, 1929, Cardinal Pietro Gasparri and Mussolini signed the Lateran Treaty. Italy recognized Vatican City as an independent sovereign state. The Vatican recognized the Kingdom of Italy with Rome as its capital. The Holy See received 750 million lire in cash and 1 billion lire in government bonds as compensation for lost territory, a payment that would fund Vatican operations for decades. Vatican City was born. 121 acres became a nation. The Pope was no longer a prisoner, he was a head of state. The treaty included a concordat governing church-state relations in Italy. Catholicism became the state religion. Religious education became mandatory in Italian schools. Church marriages gained civil validity. The arrangement favored the church enormously and gave Mussolini the papal blessing that enhanced his authority. Pius V appeared on the balcony of St. Peter's for the first time, blessing the crowd in what had been enemy territory for 6 decades. The Roman question was settled. The relationship with Italian fascism remained complicated. Pius XV publicly criticized aspects of Mussolini's regime, particularly its racism and nationalism. His successor, Pius XII, navigated the even more difficult terrain of World War II and the Holocaust. The controversies over that period continue today, and still shape debates about the Vatican's moral authority. But the Lateran Treaty survived Mussolini's fall. It was incorporated into Italy's post-war constitution. The relationship between Vatican and Italy has evolved through subsequent concordats, but the basic recognition established in 1929 remains. The Vatican is a sovereign state because a fascist dictator and a pope made a deal. The territory lost in 1870 was never recovered. The Papal States vanished from history. Central Italy became part of the Italian Republic, but 121 acres surrounded by Rome became something no previous papal territory had been. An internationally recognized country with full sovereignty. The prisoner emerged from his cell. The kingdom, vastly reduced, survived. In June 1982, a banker named Roberto Calvi was found hanging under Blackfriars Bridge in London. Bricks had been stuffed into his pockets. His passport was fake. He had fled Italy days earlier, fearing arrest. Calvi ran Banco Ambrosiano, the largest private bank in Italy. He was known as God's banker because of his close connections to the Vatican, specifically to the Istituto per le Opere di Religione, the Institute for the Works of Religion, commonly called the Vatican Bank. When Banco Ambrosiano collapsed, investigators found a hole of approximately $1.4 billion. Much of it had been funneled through shell companies connected to the Vatican Bank. The scandal exposed relationships between Italian finance, organized crime, Masonic lodges, and the Vatican that seemed to belong in a thriller novel. The Vatican Bank had been founded in 1942 by Pius V, consolidating earlier financial operations into a single institution. Its stated purpose was to serve the Church, managing assets of religious orders, handling Vatican operations, processing donations from Catholics worldwide. But the bank's unique status created opportunities for abuse. Vatican City is not part of any international banking regulatory system. It does not report to oversight bodies that monitor normal financial institutions. For decades, accounts could be opened with minimal documentation. Transactions could occur without the scrutiny applied to banks in Italy or anywhere else. The bank became useful for those who wanted to move money quietly. Italian businessmen avoiding taxes, politicians hiding slush funds, less savory characters moving money for less savory purposes. The Vatican Bank didn't ask too many questions about deposits that generated fees and kept the institution profitable. Archbishop Paul Marcinkus became the bank's president in 1971. Chicago native known for his imposing physical presence, Marcinkus had served as a papal bodyguard and travel coordinator before moving into finance. He reportedly knew more about security than banking. Under Marcinkus, the Vatican Bank deepened its relationships with questionable partners. Roberto Calvi and Michele Sindona, another Italian banker with mafia connections who would later be poisoned in prison, used the Vatican Bank to move money through networks of shell companies. When Sindona's empire collapsed in 1974, exposing massive fraud, the Vatican Bank escaped serious consequences. When Banco Ambrosiano collapsed in 1982, investigators found that Vatican Bank subsidiaries had guaranteed loans worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Calvi's death was initially ruled suicide. Later investigations concluded it was murder, though exactly who killed him, Sicilian mafia, Masonic lodge members, or other interested parties, remains disputed. The Vatican Bank denied legal responsibility for Banco Ambrosiano's debts, but eventually agreed to pay $244 million to creditors in what it called a voluntary contribution. Marcinkus avoided prosecution by remaining within Vatican walls. Italy sought to extradite him. The Vatican refused, citing his diplomatic immunity as a Vatican official. He stayed in his Vatican apartment for years, finally returning to the United States in 1990. He died in 2006, never having faced trial. The scandal should have ended the Vatican Bank, or at least forced radical reform. Instead, it continued operating with only modest changes. Additional controversies followed. In 2010, Italian prosecutors froze $30 million in Vatican Bank funds being transferred through an Italian bank, citing potential money laundering violations. In 2012, the American bank J.P. Morgan Chase closed the Vatican Bank's account, reportedly over concerns about transparency. Moneyval, the Council of Europe's anti-money laundering body, repeatedly found the Vatican's financial oversight inadequate. Report after report identified deficiencies. The Vatican promised reforms. Progress came slowly. Pope Francis inherited this situation in 2013. He created new oversight bodies, appointed external auditors, and publicly committed to transparency. Some accounts were closed. Some questionable clients were shown the door. The Vatican joined international information sharing agreements, but fundamental tensions remain. The Vatican Bank's secrecy was never merely about enabling fraud. It was about protecting the privacy of the Church's global financial operations. Donations from persecuted Catholics in authoritarian countries, transfers to missionary operations in hostile territories, activities that genuinely require discretion. Drawing the line between legitimate privacy and enabling crime has proven difficult. Every reform encounters resistance from those who value confidentiality, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes not. The institution's unique status creates recurring temptations. The Vatican Bank currently holds assets of roughly $5 billion. It serves about 15,000 account holders, mostly clergy and religious institutions. Its annual reports, now publicly available, show modest profits. The days of Marcinkus and Calvi appear to be over, but the scandals damage the Vatican's moral authority in ways that reforms cannot fully repair. An institution that claims to represent divine values was caught enabling financial crimes. The juxtaposition between Sunday sermons and weekday banking practices embarrassed even loyal Catholics. And the questions persist. What exactly happened to the money that disappeared through Banco Ambrosiano? Who really killed Roberto Calvi? What other activities occurred in Vatican Bank accounts that never came to public attention? The archives remain largely closed. The full story may never emerge, but the scandal and the Vatican's initial response of denial, obstruction, and immunity claims revealed something about how the institution protects itself. When challenged, the Vatican retreats behind its walls. It invokes sovereignty. It claims diplomatic privilege. It waits for attention to move elsewhere. Often, this strategy works. The world has many crises. Vatican banking practices rarely command sustained attention, but the cost is credibility, the slow erosion of trust that accumulated over decades of scandal, denial, and minimal consequence. The Vatican maintains diplomatic relations with 183 countries. Its ambassadors, called nuncios, hold positions in capitals across the globe. More nations recognize the Holy See than recognize most actual countries. This diplomatic network makes the Vatican one of the world's most connected institutions. Information flows to Rome from every continent. Papal nuncios attend state dinners, meet with heads of government, and report back to the Secretariat of State. The Vatican sometimes knows what's happening in a country before that country's own citizens do. The network emerged over centuries of papal statecraft. Medieval popes sent legates to negotiate with kings. Renaissance popes maintained sophisticated intelligence operations. The modern diplomatic corps evolved from these traditions, professionalizing during the 19th and 20th centuries. During the Cold War, the Vatican's position became particularly significant. Pope John Paul II, elected in 1978, came from communist Poland. He understood Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe intimately. He also despised it. John Paul's first papal visit to Poland in 1979 drew millions of Poles into the streets. They came to see their countryman who had become pope, but the gathering became something more, a demonstration that the communist government could not prevent, a display of the church's power to mobilize populations that the state claimed to control. Solidarity, the independent trade union that would eventually break communist rule in Poland, emerged the following year. The movement had deep roots in Catholic networks. Priests provided meeting spaces. Church resources supported strikers. The Pope made clear his support while maintaining just enough diplomatic deniability. American and Vatican interests aligned. The Reagan administration saw Poland as a weak point in the Soviet Empire. The CIA reportedly coordinated with Vatican intelligence, sharing information about developments in Eastern Europe. Money flowed through church channels to support solidarity during the martial law period when the movement was driven underground. When communism collapsed across Eastern Europe in 1989, John Paul II received significant credit. Mikhail Gorbachev later acknowledged the Pope's role, reportedly telling aides that what happened in Eastern Europe would have been impossible without him. The Vatican's political influence extends well beyond anti-communism. On abortion, contraception, and end-of-life issues, the Vatican maintains positions that conflict with secular liberal democracies. Papal statements influence legislation in Catholic countries. Bishops lobby parliamentarians. The Church mobilizes voters around life issues that politicians ignore at their peril. In Latin America, the Vatican navigated between liberation theology, which applied Marxist analysis to poverty and oppression, and conservative Catholics who viewed such approaches as communist infiltration. John Paul II disciplined liberation theologians while maintaining the Church's option for the poor. His successor, Benedict XVI, who, as Cardinal Ratzinger, had led the effort against liberation theology, continued this approach. Francis, the first Latin American pope, has shifted emphasis. He has rehabilitated some theologians sanctioned under previous papacies. His encyclical on climate change positioned the Church alongside environmental movements. His willingness to criticize capitalism has made American conservatives uncomfortable, but even Francis operates within constraints. The Vatican's diplomatic positions reflect institutional interests, not merely one pope's preferences. The bureaucracy, the curia, shapes what reaches the pope's desk and how papal decisions are implemented. Individual popes can set directions. They rarely revolutionize institutions. The Vatican's influence is often invisible. When it works, no one notices. A quiet word from a nuncio, a meeting between a cardinal and a politician. Information passed through channels that never appear in newspapers. The Church's oldest political tool is discretion. Public positions matter less than private relationships. The Vatican cultivates connections with governments across the political spectrum. It maintains relations with both Israel and Palestine. It talks to Washington and Beijing. It positions itself as a neutral party available to mediate conflicts, and occasionally it does. Pope Francis helped negotiate the restoration of American-Cuban relations in 2014. Vatican diplomats have been involved in peace processes in Colombia, Mozambique, and other conflict zones. The Church's neutrality, real or claimed, allows it to operate where governments cannot. The price of this diplomatic flexibility is sometimes moral compromise. The Vatican maintained relations with fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, and communist states. It signs concordats with authoritarian governments that protect church interests while legitimizing oppressive regimes. Its record during the Holocaust remains bitterly contested. Critics argue the Vatican prioritizes institutional survival over moral witness. When confronting genuine evil, the Church too often chose diplomacy over prophecy. It protected its operations at the cost of its conscience. Defenders argue the Church must remain engaged to do any good at all. Breaking relations with authoritarian governments would sacrifice whatever influence the Church retains. Moral purity that abandons the persecuted faithful serves no one. This tension has no resolution. The Vatican will continue practicing realpolitik while claiming transcendent values. It will sign agreements with governments it privately considers repugnant. It will maintain channels of communication that critics view as complicity. The 183 diplomatic relationships represent investment in a particular theory of influence. That quiet engagement serves the Church better than public confrontation. That access to power matters more than prophetic distance from power. That the institution's survival enables mission that would otherwise be impossible. Whether this theory is correct, whether the compromises serve higher purposes or merely institutional interests, depends on judgments reasonable people can dispute. What cannot be disputed is effectiveness. The Vatican remains a player in international affairs, despite controlling no armies, commanding no economic resources, and governing a territory smaller than many airports. It has converted soft power, moral authority, diplomatic networks, information, into influence that larger states would envy. The smallest country in the world punches far above its weight, and it has been doing so for a very long time. In 2002, the Boston Globe published an investigation that would shatter the Catholic Church's moral authority in America and eventually worldwide. Reporters discovered that Cardinal Bernard Law had known about priests sexually abusing children in his archdiocese and had responded by transferring them to new parishes where they abused again. The pattern repeated across decades. Hundreds of victims, dozens of perpetrators, and a systematic cover-up that prioritized the Church's reputation over children's safety. The Boston revelations triggered similar investigations in dioceses across America, then across Europe, then worldwide. Country after country uncovered the same pattern. Priests abusing, minors, bishops hiding the abuse, victims ignored or silenced. The numbers became staggering. A 2004 study commissioned by American bishops identified over 4,000 priests credibly accused of abusing minors since 1950. A Pennsylvania grand jury report in 2018 documented over 1,000 child victims and 300 predator priests in 6 dioceses alone. Investigations in Ireland, Germany, Australia, Chile, and other countries added thousands more cases. The Vatican's initial response was inadequate. John Paul II, by 2002 in declining health and focused on his historical legacy, seemed unable or unwilling to grasp the crisis's magnitude. He praised Cardinal Law even as Boston demanded Law's resignation. He approved policies that improved reporting requirements, but did not fundamentally address the enabling structures. Law eventually resigned and moved to Rome, where he was given a prestigious ceremonial position at a major basilica. The message was clear. Bishops who protected the institution would themselves be protected, even at significant public relations cost. Benedict XVI, both as Cardinal Ratzinger and as Pope, took the abuse crisis more seriously. He had overseen the handling of abuse cases as head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. He had read the files. He knew what had happened. As Pope, Benedict met with abuse victims, something John Paul had never done. He apologized publicly. He streamlined procedures for removing abusive priests. He accepted the resignations of bishops who had covered up abuse. His approach was disciplinary. Enforce the rules, punish the guilty. But Benedict's reforms remained largely procedural. The Vatican did not fundamentally re-examine the structures that enabled abuse. Mandatory celibacy, clerical culture, the power dynamics between priests and laity, the Church's resistance to outside scrutiny, these issues received attention from reformers, but not from Rome. Francis arrived with promises of change. He established a pontifical commission for the protection of minors, including abuse survivors as members. He created new canonical crimes for bishops who neglected to report abuse. He spoke repeatedly about the need to accompany and heal victims, yet his record has been mixed. He initially defended a Chilean bishop accused of covering up abuse, only to reverse course after withering criticism. He has resisted calls for automatic removal of covering up bishops. His reforms have faced implementation problems throughout the Vatican bureaucracy. Survivors remain frustrated. They want accountability for the bishops and cardinals who enabled abuse, not just the priests who committed it. They want access to church archives that would document what officials knew and when. They want the Vatican to cooperate with civil investigations rather than invoking diplomatic immunity and canonical secrecy. The financial costs have been enormous. American dioceses have paid over $3 billion in settlements, with some filing for bankruptcy. Insurance costs have skyrocketed. Parishes have closed. Schools have merged. The American Church's infrastructure has been permanently diminished. But the moral costs matter more. Millions of Catholics have left the Church, citing the abuse crisis as a reason. Those who remain carry shame and anger that complicates their faith. The Church's claim to moral authority, its ability to speak credibly on sexual ethics, family life, or any ethical issue, has been compromised, perhaps permanently. The crisis also revealed something about the Vatican's priorities. When confronted with priests who taught heresy, the Church acted swiftly. Theologians who questioned doctrine were silenced, removed from teaching positions, forbidden to publish. The machinery of discipline worked efficiently when orthodoxy was at stake. When confronted with priests who raped children, that machinery failed. Abusers were moved, not removed. Victims were doubted, not believed. The institution's reputation was protected while children were sacrificed. This disparity, rigorous enforcement of doctrinal conformity, lax enforcement of basic human decency, reveals an institution that lost its moral bearings. It valued the wrong things. It protected the wrong people. Reform continues. New policies have reduced abuse rates according to available data. Reporting systems have improved. Training programs now exist. But survivors continue coming forward with cases from decades past. New scandals emerge regularly. The crisis that began in Boston 20 years ago remains ongoing, and the fundamental questions remain unanswered. How could an institution devoted to protecting the vulnerable become a haven for predators? Why did so many bishops choose institutional reputation over children's safety? Can an institution that failed so comprehensively ever regain moral authority? The Vatican's answers, apologies, reforms, expressions of shame, have not satisfied survivors or observers. Something deeper seems broken, something that policy changes cannot fix. The abuse crisis may be the Vatican's defining challenge of the 21st century. How it responds, whether it truly reforms or merely manages perception, will determine whether the institution that survived Roman emperors, medieval schisms, and Protestant Reformation can survive the revelation of its own crimes. The jury remains out. Pope Francis stepped onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica on March 13, 2013, and immediately did something unusual. Before blessing the crowd, he asked them to pray for him. The new pope bowed his head while 100,000 people in the square fell silent. Jorge Bergoglio, the first pope from the Americas, the first Jesuit, the first to take the name Francis, began his pontificate by acknowledging his need for help. It was a small gesture, but deliberate. Francis wanted to signal a different kind of papacy, less regal, more pastoral, a pope who lived in a guest house rather than the apostolic apartments, who carried his own briefcase, who called people on the phone without warning. The substance of his reforms has proven more complicated than the symbolism. Francis inherited a Vatican in crisis. The abuse scandal had metastasized. The Vatican Bank remained mired in controversy. The Curia was riven by factions. Documents had leaked exposing internal conflict at the highest levels. Benedict XVI's resignation, the first papal abdication in 600 years, had raised questions about the institution's stability. Francis moved quickly on some fronts. He created a council of cardinal advisors, drawn from across the world to help him reform the Curia. He ordered audits of Vatican finances. He gave major interviews that departed from traditional papal communication. He published an encyclical on the environment that positioned the Church within global climate debates. His approach to doctrine has been more ambiguous. On divorce and remarriage, Francis encouraged pastoral flexibility while maintaining traditional teaching. On homosexuality, he famously asked, "Who am I to judge?" while the Church continued opposing same-sex marriage. On women's ordination, he definitively closed the door while creating new roles for women in Vatican offices. Critics from all directions have attacked him. Traditionalists consider him a dangerous liberal undermining settled doctrine. Progressives consider him inadequate to the reforms they believe necessary. Both sides cite the same words, interpreted differently. Francis's relationship with the Vatican bureaucracy has been tense. He has replaced officials, reorganized departments, and publicly criticized the diseases of careerism and gossip that he believes infect the Curia. The bureaucracy has responded with passive resistance, leaked documents, and slow walking of initiatives. Real reform in the Vatican requires not just papal will, but sustained institutional effort. Francis is in his late 80s. His pontificate's achievements depend on whether successors continue his direction or reverse it. History suggests reversion is common, reform is fragile. The Vatican today confronts challenges that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. Church attendance in Europe has collapsed. In countries that were once Catholic heartlands, Ireland, Spain, even Italy, regular mass attendance has fallen to single-digit percentages in many areas. Empty pews, closed parishes, elderly congregations with no one to replace them. The Church grows in Africa and Asia, but these regions cannot compensate for European decline, and growth brings its own complications. African and Asian Catholics often hold conservative views on sexuality and gender that conflict with Western trends. The Church is becoming more diverse, but also more divided. The digital age creates new difficulties. Papal pronouncements that once took weeks to circulate now generate global reaction in hours. Every Vatican document faces instant analysis. Every papal statement becomes a news cycle. The institution that specialized in slow, deliberate communication must navigate a world of viral tweets and instant outrage. Younger generations show diminishing interest in institutional religion of any kind. They identify as spiritual but not religious. They distrust hierarchies. They expect transparency that the Vatican has historically resisted. The Church's traditional appeal to authority carries less weight with people who question all authority. And yet, St. Peter's Square still fills for major events. Pilgrimages to Rome continue. The confessionals in St. Peter's Basilica still draw penitents. Priests are still ordained. Nuns still take vows. Catholics still baptize their children and bury their dead according to the Church's rites. The Vatican endures because it has always endured. It survived the Roman Empire's fall. It survived the Protestant Reformation. It survived revolution and war and scandal and schism. Every generation has predicted its decline. Every generation has been wrong, or at least premature. The Church thinks in centuries. What seems like crisis in the moment may be barely a footnote in the long sweep of institutional history. The popes who seem transformative often achieve less than imagined. The popes who seem inconsequential sometimes plant seeds that bloom. Later, Francis will die. Another pope will follow. The cardinals will gather in the Sistine Chapel, burn their ballots, and send smoke rising above Rome. The institution will continue, changed but recognizable, adapting while claiming unchanging truth. The Vatican's greatest survival skill may be its ability to simultaneously change and deny changing, to move with the times while claiming timelessness, to absorb new realities while describing them in ancient categories. Is this flexibility or hypocrisy? Wisdom or self-deception? The answer depends on your perspective, and possibly on outcomes that won't become clear for decades or centuries. What's certain is that 121 acres beside the Tiber River will still matter long after the current debates fade. The bones believed to be Peter's will still lie beneath the altar. The Swiss Guard will still wear their Renaissance costumes. The Sistine Chapel ceiling will still awe visitors who crane their necks upward. And somewhere in the Apostolic Palace, a pope, whoever he turns out to be, will still be trying to govern the most complicated institution humanity has ever created. The Vatican guards its mysteries carefully, but over centuries, some have slipped out. In 1981, workers renovating a section of the Apostolic Palace discovered a room that had been sealed for centuries. Behind a false wall lay a chamber filled with documents and artifacts that previous generations had apparently hidden deliberately. The contents have never been fully disclosed. Vatican officials acknowledged the discovery, then stopped discussing it. This is not unusual. The Vatican complex contains numerous spaces whose purposes are unknown or undisclosed. Construction over 15 centuries created layers of rooms, passages, and chambers. Some were simply forgotten as new buildings covered old foundations. Others were deliberately concealed. The Passetto di Borgo, the elevated escape corridor to Castel Sant'Angelo, is the most famous hidden passage, but it's not the only one. Beneath the Apostolic Palace, older structures contain tunnels that connected medieval buildings. Some have been mapped by maintenance workers. Others remain unexplored. The Vatican Library holds approximately 80,000 manuscripts, some dating to the 4th century. Many have never been transcribed or translated. Scholars must obtain special permission to access the collection. Even with permission, browsing is impossible. You must request specific items and hope the catalog is accurate. The catalog itself is incomplete. Items entered centuries ago may be misfiled or described incorrectly. Items may exist that were never cataloged at all. The collection accumulated over so many centuries, through so many different acquisition processes, that comprehensive documentation was never achieved. Among the confirmed holdings are the Codex Vaticanus, one of the oldest near-complete manuscripts of the Bible, dating to the 4th century. There are letters from Henry VIII seeking annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. There are trial records from the Inquisition, including the proceedings against Galileo. There are papal bulls and diplomatic correspondence and financial records spanning a millennium. The Secret Archive, now officially the Apostolic Archive, holds additional treasures. The Archives of the Inquisition, opened to scholars only in 1998, contain documentation of the Church's centuries-long campaign against heresy, the methods used, the verdicts rendered, the punishments imposed, all recorded in meticulous detail. The proceedings against the Knights Templar in the early 14th century fill entire shelves. Pope Clement V suppressed the order in 1312 under pressure from the French king, who coveted Templar wealth. The trial records document accusations of heresy, sodomy, and obscene rituals. Historians still debate whether the accusations were truthful or manufactured. Galileo's trial records were released in 1984. The documents show the Church's case against the astronomer in his own words and his prosecutor's words. The famous phrase, "and yet it moves," supposedly whispered by Galileo after recanting his heliocentric views, appears nowhere in the records. It may be legendary, but much remains sealed. Documents from the pontificate of Pius X, who reigned during World War II, were only fully opened in 2020. Scholars are still processing millions of pages. The debate over Pius's response to the Holocaust, whether he did too little, whether he worked secretly to save Jews, whether his silence was prudent or cowardly, will continue for years as researchers examine the evidence. Newer documents remain entirely closed. The Vatican's policy of restricting access to materials from the past 75 years means that documentation from John Paul II's influential pontificate cannot be studied. Researchers must wait decades more for access to records from an era many of them lived through. Some materials are classified as perpetual secrets. The Vatican has never fully explained what this category contains or why it exists. Speculation ranges from embarrassing historical documents to theological material deemed too dangerous to release. The secrecy itself generates conspiracy theories that are probably more dramatic than reality. Yet the physical architecture of secrecy is real. Doors in the Apostolic Palace that visitors never see. Rooms whose purposes are never explained. Filing systems designed to limit access. The Vatican functions on a need-to-know basis, and very few people need to know much. The papal apartment itself contains spaces that few living people have entered. The private chapel where the Pope prays alone each morning. The study where he works on speeches and correspondence. The bedroom where he sleeps. These rooms have been photographed during papal transitions, but their daily reality remains hidden. Even cardinals rarely penetrate the innermost Vatican. The Sistine Chapel during conclaves is off-limits to everyone except the cardinal electors and the central staff. The Pope's private meetings occur without public record. Confessions heard by the Pope, who remains a working priest, are protected by sacramental seal. This secrecy serves multiple purposes. It protects diplomatic negotiations that require confidentiality. The Vatican mediates conflicts precisely because parties trust their communications won't leak. That trust depends on demonstrated discretion over centuries. It protects the privacy of living individuals mentioned in documents. Church records include sensitive personal information, marriage annulments, laicization proceedings, disciplinary actions that could harm people if disclosed. It protects the institution from scandal. This is the most controversial purpose. The Vatican's history of concealing abuse, financial crimes, and diplomatic embarrassments demonstrates that secrecy can serve self-interest rather than higher purposes, and it maintains mystique. An institution accessible to all would lose some of its power. The sense that hidden knowledge exists behind those walls, that priests know things lay people don't, reinforces the Church's authority. The Vatican has released more material in recent decades than at any point in its history. Digitization projects have made some holdings available online. Researchers have greater access than their predecessors enjoyed. The trend toward openness is real, but the fundamental architecture of secrecy remains. Files are still classified. Rooms are still closed. The Vatican decides what the world may know and when. This power, the power to control narrative by controlling evidence, may be the most significant power the Vatican possesses. The bones of Peter may lie beneath the altar. The true history of 2 millennia lies in archives that most people will never see. Karol Wojtyła was not supposed to become pope. He was 58 years old in October 1978, relatively young for a cardinal. He came from Poland, behind the Iron Curtain, where the Church survived communist persecution through quiet resistance. No pope had come from Eastern Europe in over 4 centuries. No pope had come from a communist country ever. The cardinals gathered in the Sistine Chapel expecting to choose between Italian candidates, as they had for centuries. The first conclave of 1978 had elected John Paul I, who died after just 33 days in office. Now they needed to try again. 8 ballots passed before Wojtyła emerged with the necessary votes. He chose the name John Paul II honoring his brief predecessor. When he appeared on the balcony, Romans didn't recognize him. "Who is this Polish guy?" one observer reportedly asked. They would learn. John Paul's pontificate lasted 26 years, the second longest in history. He transformed the papacy into a global media phenomenon. He traveled more than all previous popes combined, visiting 129 countries. He drew crowds that rivaled rock concerts, 1 million in Poland, 4 million in the Philippines, 5 million in Manila for World Youth Day 1995. He was theatrical by nature. An actor and playwright in his youth, he understood how to command attention. His speeches were performances. His gestures were calculated for cameras. He created the modern spectacle of papal mass, stadium events with sophisticated staging, music, and crowd management. His physical presence was formidable. Broad-shouldered and athletic, he hiked, skied, and swam. When an assassin shot him in St. Peter's Square in 1981, he survived wounds that should have killed him. He attributed his survival to the Virgin Mary and increased his already intense Marian devotion. The assassination attempt only enhanced his mystique. He visited his attacker in prison, publicly forgave him, and created a narrative of martyrdom and mercy that resonated worldwide. The bullet that nearly killed him was later placed in the crown of the statue of Our Lady of Fatima in Portugal. His political impact remains debated but undeniable. In Poland, his visits galvanized resistance to communist rule. The Solidarity movement drew strength from Catholic networks. When martial law was declared in 1981, the Church provided infrastructure for underground resistance. The Pope's support was essential to maintaining morale during the darkest years. When communism collapsed in 1989, John Paul received significant credit. He had maintained relentless moral pressure on the Soviet system. He had demonstrated that an alternative vision was possible. He had proved that soft power could achieve what military confrontation could not. His relationship with American intelligence during this period remains partly hidden. Evidence suggests coordination between the CIA and Vatican information networks. Money reportedly flowed through church channels to Polish resistance. The full extent of collaboration may not be known until more archives open. Beyond anti-communism, John Paul shaped Catholic doctrine for a generation. He reaffirmed traditional teachings on sexual morality with intellectual sophistication. His theology of the body presented Catholic sexual ethics as a coherent philosophical system rather than a list of prohibitions. Critics found the arguments unconvincing. Admirers considered them revolutionary. He opposed artificial contraception, abortion, and homosexual acts while developing a more nuanced theological vocabulary for these positions. He maintained the requirement of priestly celibacy. He definitively closed the question of women's ordination, declaring it beyond the Church's authority to change. He canonized more saints than all previous popes combined, 482 during his pontificate. He created the phenomenon of World Youth Day, gathering young Catholics from around the world for massive celebrations of faith. He published extensively encyclicals, apostolic letters, books of philosophy, and poetry. His failures were equally significant. The abuse crisis exploded on his watch, and he failed to address it adequately. He promoted Martial Maciel, founder of the Legion of Christ, despite credible accusations that Maciel was a predator and fraud. He resisted systemic reforms that might have limited episcopal cover-ups. His attachment to clerical authority blinded him to clerical crimes. His centralization of power reversed the collegial spirit of Vatican II. Bishops who dissented from Roman positions found themselves marginalized. Theologians who questioned teachings were silenced. The diversity that had characterized Catholicism narrowed under his supervision. His health collapsed gradually after 2000. Parkinson's disease limited his mobility and speech. He became a figure of suffering witnessed by the world. trembling at the altar, unable to speak clearly, yet refusing to resign. His insistence on continuing despite obvious incapacity created the template that Benedict XVI would eventually break. He died on April 2nd, 2005. Over 4 million people traveled to Rome for his funeral, the largest pilgrimage in Christian history. The crowds chanted, "Santo subito," sainthood now, demanding immediate canonization. The process moved quickly by Vatican standards. John Paul II was beatified in 2011 and canonized in 2014. The Pope, who had canonized hundreds himself, became a saint within 9 years of his death. His tomb in St. Peter's Basilica has become a pilgrimage site. Visitors pray before his remains, asking for intercession. The man who transformed the papacy through constant motion now rests in stillness beneath the church he served. Whether John Paul II was a saint in the theological sense remains a matter of faith. Whether he was a transformative figure in the historical sense seems beyond dispute. He took an institution that seemed irrelevant to the modern world and made it a global protagonist. He proved that moral authority, properly deployed, could reshape nations. His legacy includes both triumphs and failures, the end of communism and the metastasis of abuse. His successors inherited both the enhanced papacy he created and the crises he left unresolved. 26 years, 129 countries, 482 saints, 1 assassination survival, and a transformation of the Catholic Church that his successors are still processing. Not bad for a Polish guy nobody recognized. The doors of the Sistine Chapel close. The cardinals are locked inside. The world waits. A papal election, a conclave, is the Catholic Church's most dramatic ritual. It transforms 120 men in red robes into kingmakers. It determines who will lead 1.3 billion Catholics. It produces white smoke that billions of people watch for on television. The process has evolved over centuries, shaped by disasters that demanded reform. In 1268, a conclave in Viterbo lasted nearly 3 years. The cardinals couldn't agree on a candidate. Local authorities, frustrated by the delay, locked them in the papal palace, removed the roof to expose them to weather, and restricted their food to bread and water. A pope was finally elected, Gregory VI, who immediately enacted rules to prevent such chaos from recurring. Those rules established the conclave system. Cardinals would be sealed together until they reached a decision. Food would be progressively reduced the longer they took. No one could leave. No one could communicate with the outside. The pressure of confinement would force consensus. The system has been modified many times since. The current rules, established by John Paul II and modified by Benedict XVI, set the framework for how popes are chosen today. Only cardinals under 80 years old may vote. Currently, this limits the electorate to about 120 men. They gather in the Sistine Chapel after the previous pope has died or resigned. The dean of the College of Cardinals presides over the opening ceremonies. Before voting begins, the cardinals swear oaths of secrecy. They promise not to reveal anything about the conclave proceedings. Breaking this oath incurs automatic excommunication. Despite this threat, leaks occasionally occur, usually through indirect hints in later interviews rather than explicit revelations. The chapel is swept for electronic surveillance. Cell phones are confiscated. The cardinals are housed in the Domus Sanctae Marthae, where rooms are assigned by lot to prevent political positioning. Their movements are restricted to the chapel, their residence, and the paths between them. Voting proceeds in rounds. Each cardinal writes a name on a paper ballot, folds it, and processes to the altar. He places the ballot on a plate, tips it into a chalice, and returns to his seat. 3 cardinals selected by lot serve as scrutineers, counting the votes. To be elected, a candidate needs 2/3 of the votes. Currently 77, out of 115 or so. Anything less means another round of voting. Multiple rounds may occur each day. The process continues until someone reaches the threshold. After each round of voting, the ballots are burned. Chemicals added to the fire produce the famous smoke. Black smoke, fumata nera, means no pope has been elected. White smoke, fumata bianca, means the cardinals have chosen. The moment a cardinal receives 2/3 of the votes, the dean approaches him and asks, "Do you accept your canonical election as supreme pontiff?" If the answer is yes, the dean asks, "By what name do you wish to be called?" The new pope's acceptance ends the conclave. He is taken to the room of tears, so called because new popes often weep at the weight of what they have accepted, to be dressed in white papal vestments. 3 sizes are prepared in advance, adjusted quickly by waiting tailors. Within the hour, the senior cardinal deacon appears on the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica. Habemus Papam, he announces, "We have a pope." He announces the new pope's birth name and chosen papal name. Then the new pope appears to bless the crowd and begin his reign. The actual politics within the conclave are never officially disclosed, but enough has leaked over centuries to understand the dynamics. Campaigns are technically forbidden, but occur constantly. Cardinals meet during the interregnum, the period between popes, to discuss the church's needs and potential candidates. They lobby quietly, they form coalitions, they make promises they may or may not keep. Geography matters. European cardinals dominated for centuries, but the College of Cardinals has diversified. African, Asian, and Latin American cardinals now constitute a majority. Their concerns? Poverty, evangelization, cultural tensions with Western liberalism shape their preferences. Ideology matters more. Cardinals aligned with John Paul II's conservative approach supported Benedict XVI in 2005. When Benedict resigned, those same cardinals remained powerful but faced pressure from cardinals seeking a different direction. Francis emerged as a compromise acceptable to reformers without being unacceptable to conservatives. The Holy Spirit is officially credited with guiding conclaves. Whether divine intervention explains electoral outcomes or merely provides theological cover for political processes is a question of faith. What's certain is that conclaves combine genuine discernment with raw politics. Cardinals pray for guidance and count votes. They seek God's will and advance preferred candidates. The sacred and the strategic intertwine in ways that participants themselves may not fully understand. The results are sometimes surprising. John XXIII in 1958 was expected to be a caretaker pope. He convened Vatican II and transformed the Church. John Paul II was chosen as a compromise. He died in 33 days. Benedict XVI was the front runner. He resigned. Francis was considered unlikely. He has reshaped the papacy. When the white smoke rises, no one outside the Sistine Chapel knows for certain who will appear on the balcony. The moment of announcement remains genuinely suspenseful, even for those who have followed pre-conclave speculation closely. Then a name is spoken. A man in white emerges, and the Catholic Church, for better or worse, has its new leader. The system is medieval in origin, modified over centuries, and somehow still produces functioning results. Over 266 popes have been elected since Peter. The process continues. The smoke rises, the church goes on. Behind the museums, beyond the public areas, the Vatican contains landscapes that few visitors will ever enter. The Vatican Gardens cover approximately 57 acres, nearly half of the city-state's total territory. They stretch across the western portion of Vatican Hill, rising from the back of St. Peter's Basilica toward the Leonine Wall. Popes have walked these paths for 5 centuries. The gardens have witnessed private conversations that shaped history. The earliest gardens date to the medieval period, when popes cultivated orchards and vineyards on Vatican Hill. But the formal gardens that exist today began taking shape in the Renaissance. Pope Nicholas III enclosed the area with walls in the 13th century. Subsequent popes added features according to the fashions of their eras. The Italian Renaissance garden near the Cortile del Belvedere follows classical geometric principles. Hedges are trimmed into precise shapes. Paths intersect at right angles. Fountains provide focal points. Everything is controlled, ordered, subordinated to human design. The English garden, added later, follows opposite principles. Paths curve. Plants grow in seemingly natural arrangements. The effect mimics countryside rather than imposing geometry upon it. Walking from the Italian to the English section means moving between different philosophies of humanity's relationship to nature. Throughout the gardens, sculptures and monuments commemorate papal history. A replica of the Lourdes Grotto allows popes to pray at a site they cannot easily visit in France. A helicopter pad, installed for John Paul II, allows rapid papal evacuation if needed. A small train station, used perhaps a dozen times in Vatican history, sits near the western wall. The gardens contain functional buildings hidden among the greenery. Vatican Radio operated from a tower here until recently. The Pontifical Academy of Sciences meets in a villa surrounded by trees. Maintenance facilities service the grounds. The physical infrastructure that keeps the Vatican functioning lies concealed behind botanical beauty. Popes have used the gardens for exercise and contemplation. John Paul II walked here daily when his health permitted. Benedict XVI reportedly preferred the privacy of the gardens to the managed visibility of public appearances. Francis has received visitors in garden settings, creating photo opportunities amid the greenery. Access requires special permission. Tour groups can book through the Vatican museums, but spaces are limited. Individual visitors cannot simply wander in. The gardens remain one of Rome's most exclusive green spaces, visible from surrounding buildings but unreachable without authorization. Below ground, the Vatican grottos hold different secrets. The grottos occupy the space between the floor of St. Peter's Basilica and the ancient necropolis beneath. They were created during the construction of the current basilica, when the floor level was raised above the old church's foundation. The resulting cavity became a burial space for popes and other significant figures. Most 20th century popes lie here. Pius X, who died in 1914 as World War I began. Benedict XV, who guided the church through that war. Pius V and Pius V, who navigated the rise of fascism and World War II. Paul VI, who implemented Vatican II's reforms. John Paul I, who reigned only 33 days. Their tombs line the grotto corridors in various styles. Some are elaborate sarcophagi, others are simple stone slabs. The arrangement reflects both chronology and availability of space. Each tomb bears the Pope's coat of arms and dates of pontificate. Beyond the papal tombs, the grottos contain other burials. Queen Christina of Sweden, who abdicated her throne and converted to Catholicism in the 17th century, lies here. Several European royals rest nearby. Cardinals and other church officials fill remaining spaces. The grottos are accessible to visitors during limited hours, usually after touring the basilica itself. The atmosphere is quiet, contemplative, a contrast to the crowds upstairs. Many visitors overlook this level entirely, unaware that popes are interred directly beneath their feet. Below the grottos lies the necropolis, the Roman cemetery that Constantine's workers buried when building Old St. Peter's. This is not a space for casual tourists. Access requires advance booking, limited availability, and payment of a substantial fee. The experience rewards the effort. The necropolis tour descends beneath the basilica into streets that have not seen daylight since the 4th century. Roman tombs line both sides, their frescoes still visible after 17 centuries. Some show pagan imagery. Others reveal early Christian symbols. The transition between religions plays out in the artwork of adjacent tombs. At the center of the necropolis lies the small shrine that marks Peter's traditional burial site, the trophy mentioned by ancient writers, the spot that Constantine built his church to honor. Whatever remains there, bones or memory, represents the Vatican's ultimate claim to legitimacy. The tour guides speak quietly. Flashlights illuminate frescoes that photography cannot adequately capture. The temperature stays cool year-round. The silence feels ancient. Emerging from the necropolis into the daylight of St. Peter's Square creates a disorienting transition. You have just walked among the dead for over an hour. Now tourists take selfies and gelato vendors call for customers. The juxtaposition is jarring. The gardens above, the grottos below, the necropolis beneath, layers of Vatican history invisible to most visitors. The surface presentation, however impressive, conceals depths that only persistent inquiry reveals. Some questions have followed the Vatican for decades. They may never be definitively answered. Did Pius XII do enough to oppose the Holocaust? Eugenio Pacelli served as papal nuncio to Germany in the 1920s and as Vatican Secretary of State in the 1930s. He became Pope Pius X in 1939, just months before World War II began. He led the Church through the war and the revelation of Nazi atrocities. His defenders argue he worked quietly to save Jews, hiding them in Vatican properties and Catholic institutions. They point to Jewish testimonies praising his efforts. They note the dangerous position of the Vatican, surrounded by German-occupied territory, and argue that public condemnation would have provoked Nazi retaliation against Catholics and Jews alike. His critics argue he could have done more. He never explicitly condemned the Holocaust by name. His Christmas 1942 radio address mentioned persecution in vague terms without naming Jews or Nazis. He prioritized diplomatic relations with Germany over moral witness. His silence gave cover to Catholics who collaborated with Nazi policies. The archives from his pontificate, opened in 2020, have provided ammunition for both sides. Documents show some Vatican efforts to help Jews escape. Other documents reveal missed opportunities and problematic priorities. The debate continues, with scholars working through millions of pages that may never provide a definitive verdict. Why did John Paul II die after just 33 days? Albino Luciani was elected Pope on August 26, 1978. He was found dead in his bed on September the 28th. The Vatican announced that he died of a heart attack, but no autopsy was performed. His body was embalmed before doctors could examine it thoroughly. Conspiracy theories proliferated. Had he been murdered? By whom? The Vatican Bank? Conservative cardinals opposed to his reforms? The mafia? The theories vary in plausibility, but none have been proven. The most likely explanation is medical. John Paul had health problems that the conclave ignored in their rush to elect him. He was stressed by the office's demands. He may have died naturally of cardiovascular causes, but the Vatican's handling of his death, the rapid embalming, the lack of autopsy, the changing stories about who found the body, fueled speculation. An institution that valued secrecy appeared to be hiding something. Whether it was hiding incompetence, embarrassment, or genuine wrongdoing remains unknown. What really happened in the Vatican during World War II? The Vatican maintained formal neutrality during the war. It kept diplomatic relations with Allied and Axis powers. It negotiated for prisoners. It provided refuge to some seeking escape from persecution. But it also provided channels for Nazi officials to escape after the war. The rat lines that helped war criminals reach South America reportedly ran through Vatican networks. How much official Vatican involvement there was versus individual priests acting on their own remains disputed. The Vatican's relationship with fascist regimes in Italy and Spain raised additional questions. The Concordat with Mussolini gave the Church significant privileges. The Church's support for Franco in Spain aligned it with brutal repression. Whether these arrangements represented prudent diplomacy or moral compromise depends on perspective. What is the full extent of the abuse crisis? Despite decades of investigation, the complete picture of clergy sexual abuse remains unclear. How many victims exist worldwide? How many perpetrators? How systematic was the cover-up? The figures released so far are staggering, but they represent only cases that came to light. Victims who never reported, perpetrators who were never caught, cover-ups that succeeded. The known cases may represent a fraction of the total. The Vatican's archives presumably contain documentation of abuse cases going back decades or centuries, complaints to Rome, disciplinary proceedings, transfers of accused priests. This material remains largely inaccessible to researchers. Without it, the full scope of institutional failure cannot be measured. Some researchers have called for independent access to all relevant archives. The Vatican has resisted, citing privacy concerns and canonical confidentiality. The tension between institutional secrecy and accountability remains unresolved. What happens to Vatican finances? The Vatican's financial situation is opaque by design. Multiple entities, the Apostolic See, Vatican City State, Vatican Bank, various foundations and investment funds, maintain separate accounting. Consolidated figures are difficult to obtain. Revenue comes from multiple sources. Donations, the Peter's Pence collection alone raises over $50 million annually. Museum admissions, real estate, investments, and publishing. Expenditures include curious salaries, diplomatic operations, charitable activities, and maintenance of historic properties. Recent years have brought reform efforts. External auditors have been hired. Reports have been published. But skeptics note that the Vatican controls what information reaches auditors and what appears in reports. True independent oversight remains absent. The Vatican bank scandals of the 1980s demonstrated how badly things could go wrong. Whether current systems prevent similar problems or merely make them harder to detect is unknown. These questions share a common feature. The Vatican controls the evidence that might answer them. Archives remain closed. Witnesses maintain silence. The institution decides what the world may know and when. This control of information is the Vatican's ultimate power. It can shape historical narratives by releasing favorable documents and withholding unfavorable ones. It can wait out critics who eventually die while records remain sealed. It can promise future transparency that never quite arrives. The questions persist because answers threaten institutional interests. Complete honesty about papal behavior during the Holocaust might damage claims to moral authority. Full disclosure about abuse cover-ups might enable lawsuits. Financial transparency might reveal embarrassing details. So the questions remain open, the debates continue, and the Vatican maintains its silence, confident that time is on its side. Stand in St. Peter's Square at dawn. The tourists haven't arrived yet. The columns of Bernini's colonnade cast long shadows across the cobblestones. The obelisk that once stood in Nero's circus, where Peter reportedly died, rises against a lightening sky. The dome of the Basilica catches the first sun. For a few minutes, you can imagine the place as it has been for centuries. Before the selfie sticks and audio guides. Before the metal detectors and security checkpoints. Before the crowds that will soon fill every available space. This is the Vatican stripped to essentials: stone and memory, architecture and meaning. The accumulated work of 2 millennia, still standing, still functioning, still claiming to matter in a world that has changed beyond recognition. The Church that operates from these 121 acres has survived everything history could throw at it. It survived the fall of Rome, when barbarian armies sacked the city and the empire crumbled. The bishops of Rome became the most stable authority in a collapsing world. They negotiated with invaders, fed the starving, maintained what civilization remained. It survived the schism of 1054, when Eastern and Western Christianity split over theology and politics. Constantinople went its own way. Rome kept its claim to universal authority, even as half the Christian world rejected it. It survived the Reformation, when Luther and Calvin and 100 other reformers tore apart the religious unity of Europe. Millions left. Whole countries declared independence from Rome. The church that emerged was smaller, more defined, more centrally controlled, but still functioning. It survived revolution. The French Revolution stripped the church of its property and killed its priests. Napoleon imprisoned popes. The Italian Risorgimento took the Papal States. Each crisis seemed existential. Each was ultimately absorbed. It survived the 20th century. 2 world wars, fascism, communism, the sexual revolution, the abuse crisis. Every decade brought new challenges. The institution adapted, sometimes badly, sometimes well, but always continuing. And now? The church faces a different kind of challenge. Not persecution, but indifference. Not attack, but erosion. In the developed world, fewer people care what the Vatican says about anything. They have stopped arguing with church teachings. They have stopped listening altogether. Attendance declines. Vocations shrink. Parishes close. The infrastructure built over centuries proves impossible to maintain, with diminishing resources and aging congregations. The institutional church contracts steadily, yet the Vatican endures. The crowds still come to St. Peter's Square. The pilgrims still pray at the shrines. The Pope still appears at his window on Sundays. The machinery of global Catholicism still grinds forward. The institution thinks in centuries. What looks like decline in a decade may be merely fluctuation across a millennium. The church has been pronounced dead many times. It has always surprised its undertakers. Or perhaps this time is different. Perhaps the forces reshaping human consciousness, secularization, individualism, the collapse of institutional trust, represent a permanent change rather than a passing phase. Perhaps the Vatican's power will fade until it becomes merely a museum, a tourist attraction, a historical curiosity. The stone offers no answers. The dome catches the morning light. The faithful line up for daily mass. The curious line up for museum tickets. The Swiss guards take their positions. Another day begins. The bones believed to be Peter's lie in darkness beneath the altar. A fisherman who followed a carpenter who changed history. His grave, or what people believe is his grave, anchors an empire of faith that spans the globe. Every pope since Constantine has been buried near this spot. Every pope since Constantine has claimed authority descended from Peter. Every pope since Constantine has governed from this hill where chariots once raced and Christians once burned. The Vatican is many things: a country, a church, a museum, a scandal, a mystery, a claim to truth that billions believe and billions reject. But above all, the Vatican is a persistence, an institution that has outlasted every government, every empire, every ideology that has tried to destroy or ignore it. An institution that may yet outlast whatever comes next. The sun rises over Rome. The Vatican wakes. The story continues.